Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. Powerful words.
Are.
From Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. And that's what we're diving into today, the book of Daniel.
A book full of faith and courage and divine revelation. You know, the book of Daniel really gives us a look into what it means to live out your faith, even when everyone around you, believes something different. So we'll be following Daniel, a young Jewish exile, as he navigates life in Babylon and ends up, rising to prominence.
Through his wisdom.
Yes, and unwavering trust in God.
And we'll be uncovering how he interprets dreams, challenges authority, really faces some insurmountable obstacles.
Right.
But we're going to start with his early life in Babylon.
Okay.
Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 to 16. Daniel and his friends, they make a really difficult choice. They refuse to defile themselves with the king's food and wine.
Right, which is a huge act of resistance.
That is.
I mean, think about it. It shows how committed Daniel is to God's law, even under pressure. I mean, the internal conflict going on and what could happen to them if they defy the king like that.
Well, and it's fascinating because their decision leads to some really unexpected benefits.
Absolutely.
Daniel chapter 1, verses 17 to 21. It says that they end up being healthier, sharper than everyone else, than those who indulged.
Right.
And they impressed the king with their wisdom.
You see, their faithfulness, their commitment to what they believe in, it actually ends up leading to unexpected blessings.
And it really does set a precedent for his whole journey.
It does. It does.
Because his unwavering faith,
right.
it becomes a guiding principle.
Right.
For all the challenges he faces.
For all the challenges. Like when King Nebuchadnezzar has this really troubling dream.
Troubling. And he demands, Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 to 13, that his wise men not only tell him what he dreamt, but interpret it as well.
Oh, and the penalty for failure, death.
Yeah, talk about high stakes.
Yeah, this just shows the absolute power of the king and how vulnerable everyone was, even the most skilled advisors.
Yeah.
They're left powerless.
Daniel, though, doesn't hesitate to seek divine guidance.
Right.
Verses 14 to 19, he and his friends pray for God's revelation. This act of faith is so crucial to what happens next.
Yeah, because Daniel receives the content of the dream and its interpretation. In verses 31 to 35, he describes this magnificent statue. It's made of all different kinds of metals representing all these different kingdoms. But then a stone, symbolizing God's eternal kingdom, comes and hits the statue and shatters it completely.
Wow. So this dream provides such a profound perspective on the rise and fall of empires.
It does.
And it points to the ultimate sovereignty of God. And I think it invites all of us to consider, how this ancient message, what it might mean for us, for our own understanding of history, and all the powers that are at work in our own world.
Absolutely. I mean, Daniel being able to interpret that dream, it definitely raises his standing with the king.
It does.
But it also sets the stage for a more fiery trial. Literally. Because Nebuchadnezzar, he goes and builds this huge, giant golden statue.
Yeah.
And he decrees that everyone has to worship it or face death.
This decree, as described in Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, forces this direct confrontation between what the king demands and what Daniel believes. Yeah. It's a pivotal moment. Compromise is not an option here.
No. And it's Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They show incredible courage. In verses 16 to 18, they boldly declare that they're going to stay true to God. They refuse to bow down to that golden statue, even though, the fiery furnace is, looming over them.
It's one of the most iconic scenes in the Bible. They're thrown into this blazing inferno.
Right, but then a miracle happens.
Verses 24 to 25.
Right. Nebuchadnezzar, he sees a fourth figure.
Walking with them.
In the flames, unharmed.
This event has a huge impact on Nebuchadnezzar.
Really?
Verses 28 to 30. He acknowledges the power of the God that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego serve. And he even issues a decree protecting their right to worship.
A real testament to the impact of their faith, unwavering faith.
However, Nebuchadnezzar's journey of faith,
it
takes another dramatic turn when he has another troubling dream, this time about a magnificent tree being cut down. And once again, Daniel's called upon to interpret this very symbolic vision.
Yeah, Daniel, in chapter 4, verses 4 to 27, he tells Nebuchadnezzar that this dream, it's foreshadowing his own downfall. He's warning him that pride, it will lead to his humiliation. He'll go through this period of madness. He'll lose his power, his sanity. It's a huge warning about what happens when we let arrogance go unchecked, and really emphasizes the need for humility before God.
And this prophecy comes true. Nebuchadnezzar is humbled, driven to live like a wild animal. For a time. Yet in verses 34 to 37, we see his restoration. He acknowledges God's control over his life and over the rise and fall of kingdoms. It's a powerful example of how recognizing a power greater than ourselves can lead to genuine transformation.
Right. And then we move to Belshazzar's feast, where he takes those sacred vessels from the Jerusalem temple and uses them for a drunken party. Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. It's just this act of sacrilege. And then this chilling sign, a mysterious hand appears and writes on the wall.
And once again, Daniel is called upon to interpret the impossible. Verses 10 to 16. His reputation as this wise interpreter, it precedes him. Even Belshazzar, despite his arrogance, recognizes Daniel's connection to the divine.
And Daniel, he decodes the message in verses 25 to 28. It's a judgment against Belshazzar's pride. His kingdom is about to fall. The inscription, men tekel aparsin, God's decree that Belshazzar's reign has been measured and found wanting.
And just as foretold, his kingdom falls that very night. Verses 30 to 31, we witness this swift fulfillment of prophecy, highlighting the consequences of ignoring those divine warnings and the certainty of God's word. Now, on to perhaps the most well-known story, Daniel in the lion's den.
Chapter 6. Daniel is serving a new king, Darius.
Right.
And despite his faithfulness, his competence, he becomes the target of this jealous plot. I mean, verses 1 to 9, his enemies, they trick the king into issuing this decree that you can't pray to any god or man except the king himself for 30 days.
So this decree puts Daniel in an impossible situation.
It does.
He has to choose between his devotion to God and obeying the king. It's a trap designed to silence his faith.
It is. But Daniel, his response is incredible. Verses 10 to 23, knowing the consequences, he continues to pray openly.
Openly. This leads to his arrest and him being thrown into the lion's den.
It does. And Darius the king, he realizes he's been manipulated, but he can't change the decree. He spends a sleepless night worrying about Daniel, hoping for a miracle.
And a miracle is what he gets.
He does. Because when morning comes, Daniel emerges from the den, completely unharmed, protected by God.
Wow.
And then there's this huge reversal. Daniel's accusers are thrown into the den. They meet their demise. And Darius, he publicly acknowledges the might of Daniel's God.
It's not just about God's protection over Daniel. It's also about the power of faith. Even in the face of adversity, even in seemingly hopeless situations, trusting in God can lead to unexpected deliverance.
So we've seen how Daniel navigates this complex and often hostile world while staying true to his faith. What are your initial impressions? What resonates with you most about Daniel's experiences so far?
I think his commitment to prayer, his willingness to stand up for his beliefs, even when it meant risking his life, it's really inspiring. For example, in Daniel chapter 7, he describes this vision of 4 beasts emerging from the sea, each one representing a different kingdom.
And the imagery is so vivid, so terrifying, really showcases the power, the destructive nature of these kingdoms. It's no wonder that Daniel is deeply troubled by these images. In verses 15 to 16, he asks for an interpretation.
It's really striking how these beasts are described. A lion with eagle's wings, a bear with ribs in its teeth, a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. It's almost cinematic.
Right. But that vividness, it has a purpose. It's not just about the power of these kingdoms, it's also about how fleeting they are. You have to remember, Daniel is living in a time when empires are constantly rising and falling, often violently.
And amidst these monstrous beasts, this figure, described as one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, appears in verse 13.
And this figure, he approaches the Ancient of Days, representing God, and receives dominion and glory, and an everlasting kingdom. Such a powerful contrast to the temporary and destructive reigns of those beasts.
So this vision, it introduces this concept of God's eternal kingdom.
Yes.
The kingdom of righteousness and justice.
Yeah.
That goes beyond any earthly empire.
Right. And it's a message of hope amidst all the chaos and turmoil of human history.
And in verses 17 to 27, the interpretation reveals that the saints of the Most High will inherit this everlasting kingdom, reinforcing this key theme.
Right.
That despite how things look, God is in control.
And his purposes will prevail.
These contrasting images, these terrifying beasts representing earthly kingdoms, and this triumphant figure symbolizing God's eternal reign, they create this sense of both warning and hope.
They do.
Earthly power is temporary, often corrupt.
Yes.
But God's kingdom, that will endure.
Now, if we move on to Daniel chapter 8, we see another vision. This time it involves a ram with 2 horns and a goat with a prominent horn.
Yeah, even Daniel finds this one perplexing.
He does. But the angel Gabriel, He appears to help Daniel interpret what he's seeing. And in verses 16 to 22, Gabriel explains that the ram symbolizes the kings of Media and Persia, while the goat represents the king of Greece. And the horns, they symbolize specific rulers and their rise to power.
It's really fascinating, this glimpse into the historical context of Daniel's visions, how specific events and empires fit into God's plan, but then things take a darker turn.
Yeah.
In verses 9 to 12, this little horn emerges.
Right.
And it starts causing widespread destruction. It attacks the host of heaven and the sanctuary. This image really suggests a powerful and oppressive force opposing God's people and his purposes.
The little horn has been interpreted in many different ways. Some people see it as a specific historical figure.
Oh, interesting.
While others see it as more of a representation of that ongoing struggle between good and evil throughout history.
Regardless of how we interpret it, the little horn, it reminds us that even though God's kingdom will ultimately be victorious, there will still be these periods of intense struggle and persecution.
Now, in Daniel chapter 9, there's a shift. Daniel isn't just passively receiving visions anymore. He's actively interceding for his people. He's deeply concerned about what's happening in Jerusalem, about his people being in exile. So he turns to God in prayer.
Verses 3 to 19 is such a beautiful prayer, so humbling. Daniel acknowledges the sins of his people. He expresses remorse. He longs for God's forgiveness and restoration. He appeals to God's mercy and faithfulness, reminding him of his promises.
It really is a model prayer for us. It encourages us to approach God with humility, recognizing our own flaws, and pleading for his grace. Our petitions shouldn't be based on what we think we deserve, but on God's unwavering love and compassion.
And as Daniel's praying, something incredible happens. In verses 20 to 23, the angel Gabriel appears again. This time, he brings a message of hope and a timeline for when God's promises will be fulfilled.
It really shows the power of prayer, how we can open up communication with God. It's a reminder that God hears our prayers, and he responds according to his perfect timing and his will.
Gabriel, he outlines this period of 70 weeks, determined for Daniel's people and Jerusalem. These symbolic weeks, representing years, point to a future time of restoration and everlasting righteousness.
This prophecy, it's known as the 70 Weeks prophecy, has been the subject of much debate and interpretation. But at its heart, it's a message of hope. It promises that God's plan of redemption will be fulfilled, and his people will ultimately be restored.
It's remarkable how these visions, prophecies, and angelic encounters all weave together.
They do.
To reveal God's plan for the world. Each element contributes to this larger tapestry that unfolds across history.
But we're not done yet. Daniel's final visions are definitely apocalyptic. We see angelic encounters, glimpses into future conflicts, and profound messages about God's sovereignty and the ultimate triumph of good over evil.
It all starts in Daniel chapter 10 with this really vivid encounter. Daniel is by a river and he sees a man clothed in linen. But this guy has a dazzling appearance.
Oh yeah, it describes him having a body like beryl, eyes like fire, and a voice like a multitude.
It's both awe-inspiring and terrifying.
It is. In Daniel, he's totally overwhelmed. He loses his strength, falls into a deep sleep. The angel actually has to touch him so he can stand up.
Wow. But even though this encounter is so intimidating, the angel reassures Daniel in verses 11 and 12. He tells him that he's greatly beloved and that his prayers have been heard.
You see, even in the presence of these powerful angelic beings, God's love for Daniel, it's still there.
It's a really comforting reminder that no matter how overwhelming things get, God's care for us never wavers.
Right. And then the angel reveals something pretty astonishing. In verses 13 to 21, he tells Daniel that he's been battling spiritual forces, specifically the prince of the kingdom of Persia.
So this gives us a glimpse into this cosmic struggle that's happening behind the scenes of human history.
Yeah, this spiritual battle between good and evil. It helps explain the challenges and conflicts we see in the world. It suggests that it's not just earthly powers at work. There are these spiritual forces vying for influence.
And then chapter 11 is just this whirlwind of historical prophecy. It details the rise and fall of kings and empires, focusing particularly on the conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south.
Yeah, it outlines wars, alliances, betrayals. It can feel a little overwhelming.
It can.
But it's not meant to be this precise historical timeline. Instead, it reveals patterns. It shows us God's hand in history.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture, God's overarching plan unfolding through these events.
Exactly. And within all these historical details, there are some key themes to notice, like the emergence of this vile person who comes to power, described in verse 21. This person deceives and oppresses God's people.
And verse 25 goes on to describe this vile person as someone who speaks great words against the Most High and wears out the saints of the Most High. This foreshadows future persecution and apostasy.
Right. But even amidst these trials, there's this message of hope in verse 32. The people who know their God shall be strong and do exploits.
So even in the darkest times, faith and perseverance, they lead to victory.
They do. And then we come to the culminating chapter, Daniel chapter 12. It starts with a description of a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation in verse 1.
This passage, it's often called the Great Tribulation. It talks about this period of intense suffering, unprecedented challenges for God's people.
Right. But within this bleak description, there's also a promise of deliverance in verse 1. And then in verse 2, we see this remarkable statement about the resurrection of the dead. Some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt.
It introduces this concept of ultimate judgment, God's final victory.
It points to a time beyond this earthly life, when justice will be served and God's reign will be fully established.
And then we come to those powerful words from Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever.
Such beautiful imagery. It offers a beacon of hope and a promise of eternal reward.
It reminds us that no matter what trials and tribulations we face in this life, God's faithfulness and love ultimately win.
They do. And this final message really captures the essence of Daniel. It doesn't shy away from the reality of evil and suffering, but it always points us back to the hope we have in God.
Daniel's story encourages us to be faithful, to persevere through challenges, and to trust that God is working everything out for good, even when we can't see the full picture.
Absolutely.
So as we conclude our deep dive into Daniel, I think we're left with this sense of awe at God's sovereignty and the enduring power of faith.
I agree. Daniel's journey has given us these valuable insights into navigating a complex world, standing strong in our beliefs, and finding hope in the midst of uncertainty.
We hope this exploration has encouraged you to delve deeper into the book of Daniel. Discover its wisdom for yourself. Thanks for joining us on By the Pages. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more enriching discussions on Scripture.